This is the Yao Leadership Podcast.
So there are measures of performance, and what we wanted to get at was, in shorthand, what we call leadership style. But the reason it was coming up is because, as you can imagine, there are organizations based on their size and where they are and what's going on that are at very different places. We have seen a tendency among exceptional leaders to have a dominant particular kind of style which becomes more pronounced and successful over time. And it could be there's a dominant and a secondary, but the flip side is never true, which is
Welcome to the Yao Leadership Podcast. My guest today is an exceptional leader and author, Robert Jordan, author with Olivia of the book Right Leader, Right Time. Good afternoon, Robert. As we start the conversation, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Thank you. So my formative years, I was in magazine publishing. I dropped out of business school. My fellow students thought it was crazy. I started the first magazine in the world that covered online and internet. I did that for about 10 years and then sold the magazine to a big publisher. The subtext is any mistake you can make in your business. I was in my 20s, and any mistake you can make in business, I guarantee you I made it at least once, but survived and eventually thrived because, we all know the internet came around and it put me on the Inc. 500 list for fastest growing businesses in the US. So I did that. Selling was not an event like, gee, I'm going to go retire. And, the Zen expression, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yes.
Somewhat magically, an acquaintance told me what he did for a living right around the same point when I was selling. And he had this weird job title, interim CEO. And I didn't know what that was. But what he said is that he would kind of parachute in with venture funding in early stage companies. And that blew me away. And then he handed me his card, and his card said CEO of Yahoo. And because I was in the online industry, even though it was small, we all knew that these first directories were going to go public on zero revenue. Not zero earnings, but zero revenue. It was a real kind of sea change in the world. So that energized me. I said to this person, whether you like it or not, you're now my mentor. And I came home. I had seen him in Silicon Valley, and I bought domain names, interimceo.com and interimcfo.com, hung out a shingle and started doing projects with companies. Did that for a number of years. Then social networks came around, decided that I was really interested how many people in the world were doing leadership gigs like me. And so we formed an organization that eventually became Interim Execs, which somebody could look up and see now. It's a global kind of matchmaking capability, organizations, both for-profit and nonprofits, with remarkable C-suite leaders, CEOs, CFOs, CIOs.
Great. That's really, really impressive. You're talking about the your contact that you met right at that particular time, and I was having a conversation recently about sponsors and people who open doors to us, and it's very important to be attentive to all these avenues and really seize on those opportunities and go get them. Actually,
yeah, I think anybody. Well, I would just say for myself, everybody that I've ever met who has been successful, you'll hear this series of events in their life. You'll hear about setbacks, but you'll hear about these miraculous occurrences. And they generally are around people who show up and support them, encourage them, where the epiphanies occur. And I'm right at the head of my list for that in terms of, having had a series of mentors show up at the right time.
Excellent. Now, we're going to talk about the book in a moment, but a book that I recommend everybody reading. And I listened to the audiobook, which was great material, by the way. And there was one sequence, unfortunately, that got cut. That was when one of your guests asked you about your family background. So that got me curious, and I thought, I'm going to ask Bob about his family background, because I believe that for everyone, there's some event that happened to us during our upbringing, generally around 9 years old, that define who we become and who we are now. So what would you say that event will be for you?
I feel like a test I'm about to fail. You're reminding me of something in the audio version that I've totally spaced on. just for your listeners to know, and I appreciate this, Max. The book that we authored, Right Leader, Right Time, the audio version has 4 hours of bonus material. We went back into recording studios with we interviewed a lot of leaders for the book in these various leadership styles, and we went back into recording studios with 8 of them. These 4 styles we label fixer, artist, builder, strategist. And so we had 2 remarkable fixers, 2 remarkable artists, 2 remarkable strategists, 2 remarkable builders. So did I say something specific in that instance, or can I just generalize here?
No, it was just, it stopped before you were able to give any of the answers.
Oh, I see. Well, I will tell you that I think for a lot of folks who grow up and attain leadership roles, their fathers are a primary influence. In my case, it's my mother, which may be a little bit more rare, but my mom was one of the first advertising executives in Chicago. Have this wonderful picture of her looking at blueprints in front of a building going up the prime shopping district in Chicago, and it's all guys with her. And she was the shot of ambitious I got.
Absolutely. No, I've got a lot of steer from my mom as well in what I do professionally. Their stamina is just remarkable, moms, that is. Now, this podcast is about leadership. And it's for corporate leaders and entrepreneurs who want to grow in their leadership skills. What is your definition of leadership?
Well, for purposes, we have a very basic definition of leadership, which is responsibility for one or more people in an organization. And the reason it's that basic is because we also developed, in the process of developing a leadership assessment tool. And so the literal part of it for us is if you've got responsibility for another person, a client, a project, you are showing leadership. Now, I want to hear your definition of leadership, Max.
My definition of leadership is around what I think is at the heart of leadership. Now, you talk about responsible for one or more people, because I think leadership is about influencing others in taking action. And that's how I define leadership. It's all about influence. It's how you get others to take action towards a common goal. And I developed this notion of self-empowerment leadership because I think it all starts with the leader, and they are what I call the 2 pillars around the self-empowerment leadership framework that I developed, which is responsibility and commitment to service. That's it for me at the heart of leadership.
I've heard you say that before, and I agree with you. I do.
Absolutely. No, thank you. So how did your interest for leadership started?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I think it's interesting. I've talked with folks about this, about whether we are hardwired for this or more becomes environmental over time. I noticed early on, though, for me, like I'd be playing with other kids when I was young, and I was the one like, let's go build a go-kart, and assigning kids, to go do various tasks. And there was a point when I was fairly young, 5, 6, 7 years old, and I realized like I'm directing everyone's work. I didn't use the word directing in my head, but it just struck me as pretty cool that everybody was building something together.
Yeah, it's true that it starts very early. I agree with you. I think there's some natural inclination to leadership because leadership is a set of skills. But because it's skills, I believe everybody can learn to become a great leader. And it's about self-awareness and putting the light on where we really need to develop as a leader. Which really takes me to the book that you wrote, because you wrote about a framework. You tried to build a framework around leadership. Can you tell us a bit about the genesis of the book? How did the idea came about, and how did you bring it to reality?
We developed a leadership framework around 4 different styles or kinds of energy. Style is there are components around your process, your approach, and for successful leaders, even somewhat of a system that they have. And we gave these 4 labels: fixer, artist, builder, and strategist. And the way that this came about is because my co-author and I have a day job running a company called Interim Execs, and in that organization, 7,000 executives from 50 countries had approached us. Well, as you can imagine, you need to get organized when that's occurring. And so we developed ranking and scoring and screening in the process of developing this ability to be a matchmaker in the world. And we saw 2 patterns. One was not so good, kind of disturbing, and that was that the majority of leaders approaching us were having careers and leadership journeys we would have described as okay or average, but not better than that. The flip side was that among the top 2, 3, 4%, we would describe those people as exceptional. And among exceptional leaders, we saw one of these 4 different leadership styles as being dominant. In some cases, a dominant in the secondary. But they were not exhibiting the trait we saw in the majority of leaders, which was too much of a tendency to be all things to all people. And that was something that compelled us to write. We thought there was a message that should get out to the world, especially for people earlier in their careers, early in their leadership journeys, cautionary, which is do not attempt to be all things to all people. And that's easy to say and very hard to do early in career, because early in career, you need the money, you need the status, you need the job. And so there's a tendency to try to do too much.
Right.
But what we observed over time was that exceptional leaders, the more accomplished they become, tended to reject more of what was not for their highest and best use.
Right.
And that was something fundamental that we really feel compelled to get out as a message to the world, whether someone reads the book or not.
Well, that's very interesting. I'll come back to that. But first, I want to return to something you said earlier. You talked about leadership styles. Can you expand a bit more on that? What do you mean by styles? Because the FABS framework is really focusing on style. What do you mean by style, and what other component of leadership should we be aware of as opposed to styles?
It's a great question, and these other related traits come up, which is do you have an approach or a process or a system to the way that you work? One of the things that it inspired us is, there's a particular descriptor for the way we each work intuitively that's called conative, CONATIVE, conative. And we're fans of a profile called Kolbe, KOLBE. And the founder of that, Kathy Kolbe, we thought really hit on something, which was the instinctive and intuitive way we each approach work. So that was a big inspiration for us, and something to look at and something that people could analyze for themselves. Max, I'm sure you're aware, that this whole idea of psychometrics or of analyzing ourselves at work began about 100 years ago, and that was simply with what became the IQ test, test of raw intelligence, and that's not a very good way to measure fit or performance at work. not not very not very indicative at all. And so, there were intelligence tests, and then personality tests came along, and somewhat useful, but also not exactly on the mark. And so there are measures of performance, and what we wanted to get at was, in shorthand, what we call leadership style. But the reason it was coming up is because, as you can imagine, there are organizations based on their size and where they are and what's going on that are at very different places. So to give you an example, as you and I are recording this, we're at about 2 months in where FTX blew up. FTX, this major crypto exchange. And so entities around it went bust, and there could be 1 million creditors around the world. It's terrible. Well, the court appointed a new leader, a CEO, and that person is clearly someone we would describe as fixer.
Right.
That leader has a long history. His name is John Ray, and prior to FTX, no surprise, he was at Enron, which in its time was one of the biggest business disasters. And so you can see in John Ray this kind of wiring, which is he needs to go into a burning building time after time. And that's a very different kind of energy and style from many other leaders. Like, we could go over examples of other kinds of folks more wired as artists or builder or strategists. But does that make sense?
Absolutely. So yeah, indeed, let's dive into the detail. But first, I want to understand why 4 and not 5 or 3. And are these 4 leadership style really different one to the other, or do we find overlap between them? And then we'll get into the specificity for each one of them.
It's a great question. The first thing that we want to be very clear on is we're not trying to pigeonhole anyone into only being one. All leaders call on all of their capabilities to do what they do and to be effective. So we would say that any effective leader is a mix. What we are saying is that we have seen a tendency among exceptional leaders to have a dominant particular kind of style, which becomes more pronounced and successful over time. And it could be there's a dominant and a secondary, but the flip side is never true, which is that someone is the best in the world at everything. That's impossible. So to give you a different kind of example. So Max, you and I are getting to know each other. I'm definitely coming to visit you in London. We meet at a restaurant and you're limping and your foot hurts. And if I know a great podiatrist in London, I'm going to recommend him to you. I am not going to recommend a cardiologist. I'm not going to recommend a pulmonologist. I'm not going to do that. And you would think I was crazy if I did. So, the past 100 years in healthcare and medicine has been this incredible advance, and it includes specialization, which is to the benefit of all of us in terms of longevity and freedom from pain and happiness and all of the rest. And yet in business, it is mostly an undifferentiated kind of thing where we think if someone has done one thing right, they can do anything right. And we tend to generalize more. And if they've amassed any money at it, oh my God, the world showers them with adulation and celebrity. And it is just not true that because that person did one thing right in the management of an organization or in business, that they can do all things right. So we tend to generalize too much, tend to make too much of these folks. And it is something that we need to evolve a bit when it comes to business.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. So let's try to look into them closely. Fixers, artist, builder, and strategist. Let's start with the fixer. Who is a fixer? How do you define it, and how do one recognize that they are fixers?
Fixer, as the name implies, this is someone who is expert in turnaround in dealing with crisis in organizations. This is the person that loves and needs to run into the burning building time after time. Now, the way we distinguish this is because, all leaders are called upon to solve problems. Everyone has to if you're going to be successful. The thing with the fixer is that's what they get their energy off of. And they need to keep doing that. So for example, I help run a company, but I don't get my energy off of problems like, oh, goody, more problems to solve. The fixer does. And so we'll go back to John Ray for a moment, which is, we have a phrase in the book, highest and best use. And what we would say is John Ray, appointed by the court as the new CEO of FTX, he's in his highest and best use, solving the mess of FTX and previously having done Enron and other companies. So the distinguishing energy with fixer is you need to keep doing that.
Yeah.
And if once you've proven to be successful as a fixer, if you're put back into a steady state or maintenance mode at a organization, team, project, client, you're going to go crazy. Or as one of the leaders we interviewed said, you will start breaking things so that you have something else to fix.
Yeah, I love that part of the book. Now, it's true that once you do something, as you said, people start to generalize or they start to put some label on you. And as every leader has at some point to fix something, it could be that everybody start to think that they can be fixers and then they're parachuted in some other turnaround situation. But that might not be the natural inclination or where they draw their energy. How could one make the difference and maybe get themselves more into their best and use if that was a different element of the framework?
Well, hindsight is 20/20. So this is very hard to do early in your career. This is something that becomes clearer as you're on the journey, and you can look back and observe your own behavior and your own successes to see how it's going. And it's not going to work to compare yourself to anyone else. That's not a productive thing for any of us to do. But comparing to yourself, where was I a year ago? Where was I 5 years ago? 10 years ago? What was I doing? This is where we each tend to see patterns emerging. So, with fixer, we believe it is an energy that is discovered, if you will. It tends to be that someone earlier in their career, they're very smart, they're energetic, kind of undifferentiated. And someone sees them in an organization and says, Max is doing a great job. We have this problem in another country or another division or another client relationship. He's smart. We can't solve this. Let's go throw Max at it. So you go in and it takes you 6 months, it takes you a year, 2 years, whatever it is, but you crush it. You absolutely solve the problem and you're hooked. And if you are hooked by that, boy, your organization better give you another problem, because going back to the old thing, to the steady state, ain't going to work for you anymore. So it tends to be something that fixers discover over time in their careers, as distinguished, we believe, from artists. Artist energy tends to be more something we think which is a little bit hardwired. So a standout example of artist energy in the world today is Elon Musk. And I'm referring specifically to SpaceX, Tesla, the Boring Company. He needs this kind of parallel focus, oxymoron, but he needs the distraction of more than one thing, which is a very common thing for artists, for creative-driven leaders. The artist leader sees the world as a blank canvas or a piece of clay that they're going to mold. And that is somewhat of a style that can be to their detriment. I'm strongly wired as an artist leader, and what I mean by that is I can't stop thinking things up. And when I'm with friends who have businesses, it's just a natural thing for me to instantly start thinking of new products and strategies and messages for them. It just keeps on happening, whether I want it or not. Artist energy can be at the peril of somebody's career and success. The artist on the team could be the renegade, the outsider. They're not necessarily the best liked person, but boy, can they come up with these kind of discontinuous leaps in terms of where the organization or the team or the client needs to go. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I remember in the book, some of the stories of leaders that you gave, they were quite telling. And one would think that, every leader, strategy is part of the leader's role. So you need that creativity to come up with new ideas, and even in problem solving, you need that sense. But I think here you're talking something more than that, not just around on the business or the day job. It's also what happened in their life as a whole and how that manifests itself outside of work. Is that right?
Yes, there's absolutely a tendency that it's another Zen expression. How you do anything is how you do everything.
Right. I say that because when we were preparing this podcast, you made a bold affirmation at the beginning about which type of style will suit me. So I went back listening to the book, and I think you probably got it right. But I was struggling with the creative part of artists, because that's where you think I will fall. I'm a CFO, I'm an accountant by training. I don't think it's the most creative trade in the world. You have to follow the rules. But then I see what you mean about being an artist leader.
Well, and this is for you, and so for all your listeners, when we prior conversation, we were talking, and I said, I'm sure that you at least have some artist energy in you, not to the exclusion of the others, not to say it was your dominant, but based on your creativity, even though your formal role as CFO, granted, tends to be very, very rules based, and yet here you are doing these creative things, including the podcast, because of your role at your company and what you're doing there. You have very strong fixer energy.
Yes, and that, if I look at the last two assignments, that's what I've mostly been doing.
Right.
And in terms of the builder, what characterizes the builder?
Builder is the energy which takes the nascent or the new product or small product service team to some kind of market domination or scale. For the builder, their mantra is market domination. That is what they must achieve. And I know everyone in business, we all love this builder label. We're all builders. We get that. We mean something specific around builder energy, which is what you tend to see with this as primary energy, is that when that builder has built product service team company to some kind of market domination, could be an IPO, could be a point of sale, you will tend to see that leader go back and want to do it again. You won't tend to see that person stick around where the organization is now, to use Stephen Covey's phrase, beyond their personal span of control. So Stephen Covey, the phrase personal span of control, it has to do with trust and personal relationships. A lot of fixers, artists, and builders in their roles, those teams are 5 people, 10 people, 50 people, maybe 100, but they know each other. And the contrast there is with strategist. Strategist is the leadership energy and style that is within complex organization or at vast scale. And there, that form of leadership is very different. And the language used by those kinds of leaders is very different from fixer, artist, and builder. The language of strategist, a lot of it is around loyalty to the organization, being mentored and mentoring, being cross-trained, and rising really within an organization. The expertise and these styles around fixer, artist, and builder can be much more, their careers can look more like a jungle gym as opposed to a ladder or a stairway.
Right.
And it's not to judge or say they're not advancing, but it's a very different kind of career and different kind of tool set that is needed. One of the strategist leaders we interviewed, Dr. Janine Davidson, and she was on the audio you heard, described what it was like to be, at one point, she was the Undersecretary of the Department of Defense. And what it is like in terms of influencing, to use your word, Max, systems of systems is a very different leadership experience from the other three styles.
Yeah,
As
absolutely.
to your previous question, why are there 4 as opposed to 3 or 5? You got me. And we launched, this free assessment, FABS, FABS Leadership Assessment, to test and to prove or disprove what we believe about each of these 4 styles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I find fascinating is, as you say, it gives a framework for leaders to see where they draw their energy from, and inform how they go about the assignment that they take or not take. And I guess that's going to be my next question. In your company, Interim Exec, you are exposed to demand from all over the world, and I guess your framework will help you understand how which leaders will be best suited to which assignment. What would you say are challenges, most important challenges facing leaders today, and which aspect of the leadership style they need to draw on more these days?
One of the problems, I'd love to hear your take on this, but I think distraction is epidemic. And you have to be very disciplined as an effective leader, in terms of guarding your focus and your attention. And, we're all I'm holding up my phone here for folks who aren't seeing this, we're challenged more now than we've ever been. In some ways, you would think, well, society keeps advancing and there's transparency and so many of these online tools, and you and I can see each other, Max, and so things should just be continually getting better, and they're not, or it's not a given that is the case. And so leadership, being a great leader, is as challenging now, I think, as it's ever been, and in some ways more so because technology is so pervasive in our lives and our companies. A lot of the role models that we see at large tech companies are not necessarily great leaders. That the reliance on technology within their own companies is meant to be a bit of a substitute for management, for what was traditionally known, as leadership in terms of nurturing and mentoring people working for you and within your organization. And that's more challenged now than it was before. And yet we're still human and trying to do better. And technology is not caught up with that, not fully.
And we see that with all the hype from ChatGPT and how Google, yes, to not name them, but try to race in.
Oh, look, it's very tempting. Yeah. The manager might have had a non-accretive role before, because a manager of a unit could be walking around and talking to people and saying, how you doing today? And that's a mostly useless activity. Well, if you just swap in AI, on the surface, and so there's measurement of that person in terms of how productive are they being on the surface of it, it may seem like, well, that's a great idea, but it's not necessarily more effective or results in more productivity.
But that will also, I think, accelerate or increase further the advantage of great leader, people with great competencies, because they're able to use the tool as an enabler, whereas people who might be weak in the way or not fully mastering their skills or their art, then they must struggle to take advantage of it, and that could widen the gaps.
As we're talking, Max, you're reminding me of something we did in the book, which is we asked all of these leaders, what kind of habits do you have? They're all very successful. We asked them, what kind of habits do you have that you think have contributed to this? And we got back some very practical answers. We got back some answers that were very funny. So, for example, one of the fixers we interviewed, he said, well, listen, I'll tell you one thing is, we don't make major decisions on Friday afternoons.
Right.
And that sounds like such an old school, thing in a way, because like, well, you're not all in the same office or whatever. But he said, even when you're all remote, people do gear up for the weekend in a way, the soccer game you're going to take your kid to or whatever. And so if you've instituted something major and then you have to fix it because it breaks in the next day or two, don't go do that.
Mhm.
There were a lot of very human hacks that we heard that were practical. Christy Hefner, the former chairman of Playboy Enterprises, she said that she insisted that everyone in a meeting had to voice an opinion, had to, and it had to be before her, because of course she's a commanding presence, and everyone might have thought, well, she's just going to go make this decision, and she wanted to be far more inclusive than that. I'll give you
Absolutely.
one final one, which I thought was funny, that a woman who owns a large therapy practice, hundreds of physical therapists and in school systems. And we asked, what kind of habits she has as a leader. And she said, well, I'll tell you, I've got my angry swim. Like, what do you mean an angry swim? She said, well, if I know I'm going to have to have a bad conversation with a lawyer, she said, first she would get into the pool and she would swim her frustration out. And so then she could just have a rational conversation.
Right.
I
Yeah.
thought that was great.
Excellent. So managing the energy as a whole. And
Yeah.
you talked, we mentioned it earlier about the need to develop next generation of leaders. What would you say companies should do to develop their leaders?
Well, this speaks to a bias we have, which is having more authentic conversations is a good thing. We're trying to put out something to the world as a small piece of self-learning, self-improvement, which is around your style, your own particular leadership style. And that's great when you learn it, but what's the next thing you ought to do? We believe that is take it back into the organization as a point of conversation, that the more I know, for example, about you, Max, and what drives you, the more I can help you. If we're on the same team together and we want the team to excel collectively, the better we collaborate, the better off we all are. And so the more you know about me and my style and how I'm wired, that ought to be great. And that ought to be additive and accretive to the team, and the same for you. So we want to encourage what creates more collaboration. And that's going to help develop the next generation of leaders. Not just develop, but develop the right way.
Absolutely. No, I can see and the application for that. Now, at Interim Exec, you place leaders into roles. And I think that I'm interested to hear your take on one area of leadership that I think is very important, but most companies don't do enough around. That is supporting their leaders during transitions. I have seen great leaders, high potential, flying through the ranks to be dismissed at some point because in my view, the transition to a larger role or an assignment did not take place properly. And I read some survey around the fact that about 50% of executive transition end up as a failure within 24 months. What do you think is a secret for leaders to be successful when they transition to a new role?
The first thing I would say here is I don't want to treat the question lightly or give a pat answer. I think that it's always inside of us, for starters. It's not an external circumstance that first hits us. It's what's inside of us. What it reminds me of, we did this book, Right Leader, Right Time, and we had a prior book called How They Did It. And it was a series of 45 interviews with champion company founders, as we said, from the heartland of the US. And these were phenomenal people. Collectively, they had grown organizations from zero to about $60 billion in value. And one of the leaders we interviewed, he had taken his tech company from a couple people to 2,000. And I asked him a question at one point, how did you do that? It's great, but it's a form of chaos. And he said, you have to stay at the center. And what he meant is the center of you. So the transition for an executive who is advancing can be just as traumatic as for someone who is not doing well. And the first obligation we each have is that there has to be this commitment to yourself in terms of what has you grounded and what has you centered, no matter what the external circumstances are. And this sounds so easy or obvious, but I think it's lacking for most of us. And the corollary to that, having daughters and nieces and nephews and all of that is really good thing. Start your day and just breathe.
Yeah.
If you could just collect yourself for 90 seconds and notice your breathing and think about your day and what your plan is, you're going to be ahead of the game.
Absolutely. No, that's I absolutely relate to that. And I've been moving through roles several times throughout my career. And it's true that for me, the first step is yourself and your family. And I've seen time and time again that that's part of the reason of the failure during the transition. And I make sure that I plan in advance those breathing moments, those, because I know it's going to be intense. So I need to have those moments planned out.
Yes, and this ties in, this ties in powerfully with two things, mission and ritual. Because if you personally, your organization hopefully has a mission that you can buy into and that has genuineness and authenticity, not just talk, but more than even the mission of the organization is, what is your mission? What is it that you stand for most? What do you most value? That has to be bedrock inside of you. And that then can lead to good forms of ritual, to habits that are going to reinforce it, no matter your external circumstances or what the crisis of the moment is. So the story of the woman who had the angry swim, it's a funny story. The ritual backing it up is that she had time she reserved to herself to exercise.
Great.
And all of us as leaders, we need that sense of balance. It cannot be that the on switch is on all the time. That's impossible.
So, Bob, we are getting close to the end of our conversations, and there are a number of typical questions I like to ask the guests in our podcast. First one would be, if there were 3 books that you recommend our audience, what would they be?
Well, I know you're not going to let me say my own, which is fine.
I recommend that absolutely, and I think it's right that it's the first book that we recommend, indeed.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm a big fan. I do a lot of reading, so this could be an endless list, but I'll say a few. David Brooks wrote a book called Second Mountain. It is about, if you consider kind of the metaphor of a first mountain is what you do in career, which is around money and status and success. And these are necessary things. I'm not discounting them. Then there's a point in career, hopefully, where it becomes about significance and meaning. And I found that very powerful. And especially these concepts he brings up around commitment and calling. And like you, Max, I do a lot of audio, a lot of Audible. And as I was walking around listening to this, I realized I've been at what I've been doing so many years. I'm committed to it. It's a business, so money's around it, but it's not about the money anymore. I'm compelled to do this because this is what I'm supposed to do. So I thought that was remarkable. It's a little dated in terms of its language, but I think that the message around the book by Og Mandino, it's called World's Greatest Salesman. And if the word salesman offends anybody, then I would say replace it with some close word that is gender neutral. But there's a message coming out. It's meant to be a parable, a 2,000-year-old story But it's a success kind of manual, I think, unlike anything else. The other just book I'd give a shout out to is that I had a partner named Jim Camp, and he passed away a few years ago, but he was probably the foremost negotiation coach in the world. And he wrote a book called Start With No. And it's a bit of a harsh title, but it is, for anybody in business, I think the greatest system, manual for how to become a better negotiator. And I had a hand in that book, so it's not an unbiased thing, but I think it's incredible, especially if you want to get a thorough grounding in mission and purpose.
Absolutely. You know, one of my favorite quotes is, yes, got you out of Egypt, no will take you to the promised land.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's one question I like to ask all the guests, which is, you do a lot of interviews, a podcast, and you get asked a lot of questions. What is one question that people don't ask you, or that you wish I had asked you today, and how would you have answered it?
Oh my God, you're the impossible question with the with the unknown answer. Where I'm going with this, Max, is that the world is in some ways, in the midst of so many crises. And what is it, we're going to do to go solve that? Does that make sense?
What would be the answer to the question?
It is, I feel the sense of obligation, or that we have to put energy, that you and I are both blessed with successful careers and family. And so, in a way you could say you got the world by the, the world by the tail, and it's great. And so is there more, or what is that more? Because there is still so much need in the world. There's clearly so much more that can be done, but I don't have an answer to it. Okay, here's what I would say, because I'm now discovering this as we're talking. The world has so much of what it considers formula for leadership, and yet there's still so many problems in the world, or maybe we keep on making bigger problems because we're all ambitious. And what is the obligation? How do we take that on to go solve it? And
as you were going through it, what came to my mind is what you mentioned earlier with the book, The Second Mountain. I think there's something in there about being fixated on the first mountain, and that's what we think about all the time. And by the time we get to the top, you don't have time to consider the second. And maybe it's shifting the order or bringing them together and climbing that mountain with purpose. Maybe that's the answer. But everyone will make their own answer. So what would be your final message, or what final message do you have for our listener today?
Well, for sure, to get back to the practicality of our conversation on leadership, especially for people earlier on in their careers, is that exceptional leaders reject what is not for their highest and best use. And so the challenge we all have, but earlier on in career, it's easy to say, hard to do, is the more that you can discern that which is really great for you as opposed to all the rest, the better. Because if you can gently both get yourself into situations, organizations, and projects where you get more of that and less of the other that is not really floating your boat, the better.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you for writing this wonderful book. I recommend everyone to go and read Right Leader, Right Time. It's a fascinating read that I just listened to it in one sitting. I was going on a long drive, and back and forth. It was really, really great. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Max. I'm honored to be with you.
Thank you. This was the Yao Leadership Podcast. Thank you for joining us. To listen to future episodes, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Until next time, keep being the leader everybody trusts and respects.